pinned against the cold stone of the town square. Caleb Whitman watched through a swollen eye as his own brother, Silas, stood on the podium and shook the mayor's hand, denouncing Caleb as a delusional liar to the jeering crowd. Blood from a deep gash on Caleb's forehead dripped onto the rusted metal lockbox clutched in his hands, the box that was supposed to be his salvation. The deputies tightened their grip on his bruised arms, their knuckles white, as the mayor leaned in and whispered a single, chilling sentence over the roar of the mob. Some secrets are buried in the dirt, Caleb, and some are buried in the people who find them. Just hours ago, Caleb was a respected teacher with a pristine family legacy. Now, he was a bloodied fugitive holding a document that proved his father was a murderer, while the only witness who could save him had been bought for a price Caleb couldn't match. As the police began to drag him toward the shadows of the old courthouse, Caleb realized the ancestral land the town was so desperate to protect wasn't just a site of greed. It was a graveyard. The only question left was whether he would be the next one added to the body count before the truth could be told. The attic air clung to Caleb's throat, thick with the scent of mildew and something older, something like damp wool left to rot. He exhaled through his nose, the sound sharp in the stillness, and dragged a finger along the edge of a collapsed cardboard box. Dust rose in lazy spirals, catching the weak light from the single bulb overhead. The floorboards groaned under his weight, protesting decades of neglect. He knelt, shoving aside a stack of yellowed newspapers tied with frayed twine. The headlines blurred under his palms. Local mill shuts doors, Whitman heir presumed dead. But he didn't stop to read. His fingers brushed against something cold. Metal. He pulled, and the stack shifted, sending a framed photograph clattering to the floor. The glass cracked, but the image remained intact. His grandfather, young and unsmiling, standing beside a man Caleb didn't recognize. Both wore suits too stiff for the summer heat, their collars starched into sharp lines. The lockbox was heavier than it looked. Rust flaked onto his jeans as he turned it over, searching for a latch. No keyhole, just a hasp bent out of shape. He grabbed the crowbar from his tool belt, wedged the flat end beneath the hinge, and leaned in. The metal screamed, a sound like a nail dragged down a chalkboard. The lid popped open with a dull thud. Inside, the first letter lay on top of a stack of papers, the envelope brittle at the edges. The handwriting was precise, slanted, the ink faded but still legible. To whom it may concern. No name, no date. Caleb's pulse thrummed in his wrists as he unfolded the page. The paper smelled of old smoke, of something burned and buried. He didn't read it yet. Instead, he traced the words with his thumb, feeling the indentations left by the pen. The words on the page began to sharpen as his eyes adjusted to the dim, flickering light of the single bulb. It wasn't just a letter. It was a confession, or perhaps a warning. It spoke of a brother, Silas, a name that had been scrubbed from every family dinner conversation and holiday toast since Caleb was a boy. His father, the great Judge Whitman, had always spoken of legacy as a sacred burden. Yet here was the proof that he had amputated a branch of the family tree to keep the trunk upright. Caleb's hands shook, the paper rattling like a dry leaf. Silas hadn't died in a childhood accident, as the whisper suggested. He had been erased. Systematically. Legally. The document in Caleb's hand was a draft of a public notice, never published, declaring Silas Whitman legally incompetent and removed from all inheritance. It was a death warrant for a reputation, signed in his father's familiar, arrogant script. He dug deeper into the box, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. The heat in the attic was becoming a physical weight, pressing against his chest. Beneath the letters lay a thick packet of property deeds. He fanned them out on the dusty floorboards. They weren't just old papers. They were maps of a crime. He recognized the signatures, or rather, the attempts at them. His father's handwriting was there, but the counter-signatures for the transfers of the ancestral Whitman land looked off. The ink was too heavy, the loops of the letters too deliberate, as if someone had been tracing a ghost. These were forgeries, dozens of them, and tucked between the deeds were smaller, more desperate notes, handwritten pleas on cheap lined paper. "Please, Father, I'm starving. Just a small portion of what is mine. I won't tell anyone about the laborers. I promise." Caleb felt a bile-bitter taste rise in his throat. Silas hadn't just been erased. He had been hunted into poverty while his father sat in the mahogany row office downstairs, presiding over the town's morality. A sharp creak from the attic stairs made Caleb freeze, his heart hammering against his ribs. The door groaned open, and Elena Martinez stepped into the stifling heat, her dark eyes wide with an expression that wasn't quite fear, but something dangerously close to it. She didn't look at the treasures Caleb had unearthed. She looked at the narrow dormer window behind him. "Caleb, you need to stop," she whispered, her voice tight, urgent. She moved closer, the scent of lavender and old library dust following her. "I was coming up the drive. There's a black sedan at the end of the block. 2 men inside. They aren't moving, Caleb. They're just sitting there, watching the house." Caleb wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of an ink-stained hand. "They've been watching for 50 years, Elena. I just found the reason why." He gestured to the scattered forgeries. "My father didn't just build this town. He stole it, piece by piece from his own blood. Then they know you have it," Elena said, reaching out to touch his arm. Her fingers were cold despite the heat. "The mayor's office, the sheriff. They won't let those papers leave this house. If you stay here, you're a target. We have to go. Now." Caleb didn't argue. The weight of the truth was already bending his spine. He began shoving the documents back into the lockbox, the metal groaning as he forced the lid shut. He grabbed his jacket, the heavy box tucked under one arm like a stolen child. They descended the stairs in a frantic silence, the house feeling different now. No longer a home, but a hollowed-out monument to a lie. He reached the front door and paused, peering through the sidelight. The driveway was clear, but the air felt charged, static, heavy. "I'm going to the trailer park on the outskirts," Caleb muttered, his voice a low rasp. "Silas, if he's still alive, he's the only one who can verify this. If I can find him, I can end this." "Caleb, wait," Elena started, but he was already out the door, his boots crunching on the gravel. He reached his truck, the old engine groaning as he threw the lockbox onto the passenger seat. But as he reached for the door handle, a shadow detached itself from the side of the garage. A man in a tan uniform, the silver star on his chest catching the afternoon light, stepped into his path. It was Daniel Reynolds. Caleb's cousin, a man who had grown up at the Whitman table, now a deputy sheriff with a jaw set like a trap. "Going somewhere, Caleb?" Daniel asked. His voice was pleasant, but his eyes were as cold as the Atlantic. He didn't look at Caleb's face. He looked at the rusted metal box visible through the truck window. "The aunts are worried about you. Said you were up in the attic, acting erratic. Why don't you hand that over and let me take you inside for some water?" "It's not yours, Dan," Caleb said, his voice level, though his pulse was a frantic drum in his ears. "It never was. It belongs to the man your father helped bury." Daniel took a step forward, his hand resting habitually on his belt, inches from his holster. "I'm not going to ask again. That box is family property, and you're making a scene in a town that doesn't like scenes." Caleb didn't wait for the next move. He turned to jump into the cab, but Daniel was faster, his large hand slamming the door shut before Caleb could clear the frame. The deputy lunged, grabbing Caleb by the collar and swinging him around. They hit the dirt driveway hard, the air rushing out of Caleb's lungs in a pained grunt. The struggle was ugly and silent, a tangle of limbs and desperation in the dust. Daniel was stronger, his combat boots digging into the gravel as he pinned Caleb's shoulders down, his knee pressing into Caleb's sternum. "Give it up," Daniel hissed, his face inches from Caleb's. "You're a teacher, for Christ's sake. You don't know how this world works. You think the truth matters? The truth is whatever we say it is." Caleb's hand groped blindly behind him, his fingers brushing against the heavy, leather-bound history textbook he'd left on the floor of the truck's cab during his morning rounds. His fingers hooked the spine. With a primal yell, he swung the book in a wide arc, the heavy corner catching Daniel squarely on the forearm. The deputy cried out, his grip slackening for a split second as the bone groaned under the impact. Caleb didn't waste the opening. He bucked his hips, throwing the larger man off him, and scrambled into the driver's seat. He slammed the door and turned the key. The engine roared to life, a cloud of blue smoke coughing from the tailpipe. Daniel was back on his feet, reaching for his sidearm, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Caleb threw the truck into reverse, the tires spitting gravel as he swerved around the deputy. He didn't look back as he hit the main road, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. In the rearview mirror, he saw Daniel reaching for his radio, and a second later, the blue and red lights of a patrol car crested the hill behind the house. He drove like a man possessed, weaving through the back roads he had known since childhood, the ones the police usually ignored. The lockbox rattled beside him, a reminder of the weight he was now carrying. He bypassed the town center entirely, heading toward the flats, a stretch of forgotten land where the trees were stunted and the air smelled of industrial runoff. The trailer park appeared through the haze of sunset, a collection of rusted tin cans and sagging awnings. He navigated the maze of dirt tracks, the truck's suspension groaning over deep ruts. He looked for the unit Elena had mentioned in her research weeks ago, Unit 14, tucked behind a screen of overgrown pines. It was a fortress of a trailer, the windows covered in tinfoil, a reinforced steel door looking wildly out of place on the decaying structure. Caleb killed the engine and sat for a moment, the silence of the park ringing in his ears. He grabbed the box and stepped out. He knocked on the steel door. "Silas, it's Caleb, your brother." Silence. Then, the sound of multiple deadbolts sliding back. The door cracked open, revealing a man who looked like a jagged, weathered version of the boy Caleb remembered. Silas Whitman stood there, a shotgun held loosely but purposefully in the crook of his arm. His eyes were pale, watery, and filled with a weary cynicism that made Caleb's heart ache. "You're late, Caleb," Silas rasped, his voice sounding like it had been dragged over broken glass. "I figured you'd find that box eventually. I just didn't think it would take you 20 years. Caleb stepped inside, the air in the trailer smelling of gun oil and cheap whiskey. He set the box on a grease-stained table. "I found the letters, Silas. The forgeries. I know what they did to you. I'm here to fix it. We can go to the papers, the state police. We can take the mayor down." Silas didn't look at the box. He walked over to a small, battered refrigerator and pulled out a beer, cracking it open with a steady hand. He laughed then, a wet, choking sound that held no humor. "Fix it?" Silas shook his head. You think I've been living here in the dirt because I'm a victim, big brother? You think I'm waiting for a Whitman to come save me with some dusty papers? He reached into a drawer and tossed a thick envelope onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud. Caleb opened it. Inside were stacks of $100 bills, neatly banded. The mayor sends a courier once a month, Silas said, leaning against the sink. He's been doing it since the day I left. He pays for my silence, and I spend it on staying invisible. I'm not your hero, Caleb. I'm the man who took the money to let our father die a saint. Caleb stared at the money, then at his brother. The betrayal he had felt in the attic was nothing compared to this. The conspiracy wasn't just something done to his family. It was something his family had embraced, a rot that had infected even the ones who had been cast out. But Maya, Caleb whispered, his mind racing. The mayor. He's threatening my daughter. He's going to take her if I don't give him the box. Silas took a long pull of his beer, his eyes tracking a fly buzzing against the tinfoil window. Then you better give him the box, Caleb. Because in this town, the only thing more dangerous than a lie is a Whitman who tries to tell the truth. The realization hit Caleb like a physical blow. He wasn't just fighting the mayor or the town's corrupt history. He was fighting a legacy of complicity that ran through his own veins. He looked at the lockbox, then at Silas, who was already turning away, retreating back into the shadows of his self-imposed prison. The next morning, the sun rose over the town with a deceptive, polished brightness, the kind that usually accompanied the start of the Founders' Day festivities. But for Caleb, the light felt like an interrogation lamp. He sat in a small public park near the courthouse, the iron bench cold beneath him. Across from him sat Mayor Richard Holloway, a man whose silver hair and tailored suit suggested a stability that the town's crumbling infrastructure lacked. You're a teacher, Caleb, Holloway said, his voice smooth as aged bourbon. He didn't look like a man who ordered ambushes in driveways. He looked like a grandfather. You understand the importance of civic order, this obsession of yours. It's disruptive. It's unhealthy. The truth isn't an obsession, Richard, Caleb replied, his voice tight. The forgeries I found are ancient history, the mayor interrupted, leaning forward. The smell of expensive cologne wafted over the scent of damp grass. Let's talk about the present. Your teaching license is under review. There have been complaints about your curriculum, about your mental state, and then there's the matter of Maya. He slid a manila folder across the table. Caleb opened it to find a legal petition already stamped by a judge Caleb knew had been his father's protege. It cited Caleb's erratic behavior and unstable home environment, requesting an emergency hearing for state custody of his daughter. You have 24 hours until the ceremony, Holloway said, standing up and smoothing his jacket. Bring me the box, Caleb. Admit you had a breakdown, go on a little sabbatical, and Maya stays in your house. Keep digging, and you'll find that the law has a very long memory for people who try to embarrass it. Caleb watched him walk away, the man's footsteps rhythmic and assured on the cobblestone path. He felt a cold, hollow vacuum opening up in his stomach. He drove back to the trailer park, his mind a frantic hive of half-formed plans. He needed Silas. He needed a witness who couldn't be ignored, but Silas was unmoved. I told you, Caleb, he said, not even opening the steel door fully. The money is steady. The safety is real. I'm not going on a stage to tell a bunch of people who hate me that I'm the rightful heir to a graveyard. Go home, hug your kid. Forget my name again. Caleb walked back to his truck, defeated. But as he reached for the door, he noticed something. A thin black line dangled from the undercarriage. He knelt in the dirt, his heart skipping a beat. The brake lines had been sliced. Clean, professional cuts. If he had hit the main highway, he would have been a high-speed projectile with no way to stop. He looked up, his eyes scanning the surrounding trailers. But everything was still, the residents hiding behind their tinfoil shields. He reached for the door handle to call Elena, but his hand froze. Tucked under the windshield wiper was a dead crow, its neck snapped, its glassy eyes staring at nothing. A warning. A signature. The Whitmans didn't just sue. They harvested. He managed to limp the truck into a ditch using the emergency brake, the metal screaming as it ground against the dirt. He was stranded, miles from the center of town, with a target on his back that was growing larger by the hour. He began to walk, the lockbox heavy in his arms, heading toward the only person left who might help him. He met Elena behind the town archives, the brick building looming like a silent sentinel in the twilight. She looked as haggard as he felt, her hair escaping its bun in wild, dark strands. "I found more, Caleb," she whispered, pulling him into the shadow of a large dumpster. The land deeds weren't just about the Whitman estate. They were about the ancestral land, the ridge on the north side of town, the one the developers are buying tonight. There was a labor strike there in 1912. Dozens of men went missing. Your father didn't just steal the land. He covered up why it was empty. "It's not just him, Elena," Caleb said, his voice breaking. "My mother. I found a letter in the basement of the archives when I was dodging a patrol car. She signed the final will. She knew. She was part of it." "Or she was a victim too," Elena countered, her hand finding his. "Look at the signature, Caleb. It's shaky. There are tear stains on the parchment. She didn't sign for greed. She signed for survival." Before he could respond, the sound of heavy boots echoed at the end of the alley. Two men in utility coveralls, their faces obscured by low-brimmed caps, stepped into the light. One carried a heavy wrench, the other a length of lead pipe. "Mr. Whitman," the one with the wrench said, his voice a low, guttural growl. "The mayor wants his property back. Now." The fight was a blur of shadows and pain. Caleb pushed Elena toward the basement window, yelling for her to run. He swung his tire iron, the heavy metal connecting with a dull thud against a thug's ribs. He felt a blow to his own shoulder that sent stars dancing across his vision. He scrambled backward, his boots slipping on the wet cobblestones. He saw his phone fall from his pocket, the screen shattering as a heavy boot crushed it. His map, the one Elena had marked with the location of the mass grave, was snatched away. He didn't think. He reacted. He dived through the broken basement window of the archives, the jagged glass tearing at his jacket. He landed hard on the concrete floor, the darkness of the basement swallowing him as the thugs cursed from the alley above. He lay there for a long time, the scent of old paper and damp earth filling his lungs, realizing he was now completely alone, without a phone, without a map, and with the entire weight of the town's history trying to crush him. The basement was a labyrinth of shadows, the air thick with the suffocating weight of a century's worth of secrets. Caleb huddled behind a stack of rotting ledgers, his breath hitching as he listened for the heavy thud of boots on the floor above. The thugs were still out there, prowling the alley like wolves. But for now, the silence of the archives was his only sanctuary. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled envelope he had snatched from a restricted file just before the ambush. It was a letter from his mother, dated only weeks before Silas had disappeared. As he read the frantic looping script, the last of his illusions shattered. "Richard says, if I don't sign, Silas will never come home. He says you already made the arrangements with the sheriff. Please, let my boy go. I'll give you the land. I'll give you everything. The betrayal wasn't a cold, calculated move by a matriarch. It was the desperate act of a woman being dismantled by the men she was supposed to trust. His mother hadn't been an accomplice. She had been the collateral damage. Caleb felt a hot, searing rage boil up in his chest, a fire that finally burned away the lingering traces of his own hesitation. He wasn't just fighting for the truth anymore. He was fighting for the woman who had been silenced in his own home. The morning of Founders' Day arrived with a cruel, mocking fanfare. Caleb emerged from the archives, bruised and hollow-eyed, only to find the nightmare had followed him home. As he pulled into his driveway, he saw his aunts, Margaret and Eleanor, standing beside a black Cadillac. They looked like twin vultures in their stiff Sunday dresses. "Caleb, dear," Margaret said, her voice a sharp, brittle reed. "We've heard such disturbing things. The mayor tells us you're unwell. We've come to take Maya for a few days, for her safety." Caleb moved toward them, but a man in a dark suit stepped out from behind the car. He didn't need to see the badge to know it was Holloway's private security. "You aren't taking her," Caleb hissed, his hands clenched into fists. "We already have the court order, Caleb," Eleanor whispered, her eyes darting to the house. "Don't make this harder. Think of the family name." He watched, paralyzed by the legal machinery he had spent his life respecting, as they led a confused and crying Maya into the back of the Cadillac. As the car pulled away, Margaret leaned out the window, her expression one of cold, aristocratic pity. "Be quiet at the ceremony, Caleb, for everyone's sake." He stood in the empty driveway, the silence of the house screaming in his ears. He retreated inside, his mind a jagged landscape of despair. He went back to the lockbox, the metal feeling like a lead weight. In a fit of blind, helpless fury, he slammed it against the floor, the rusted metal buckling. The velvet lining tore away, revealing a hollow space in the base. Tucked inside was a heavy, circular object wrapped in oilcloth. Caleb unwrapped it, his breath catching. It was a notary seal, a vintage, hand-cranked press embossed with the Holloway family crest. This was the tool used to finalize the forgeries. It was the smoking gun that proved the fraud hadn't happened in a courthouse, but in the mayor's own private study. It was the physical link between the historical crime and the current administration. He didn't wait. He drove to the mayor's office complex, the adrenaline overriding the pain in his ribs. He bypassed the main entrance, finding a service window he knew stayed unlocked for the cleaning crews. He slipped inside, the darkened hallways of the courthouse feeling like the belly of a beast. He reached the mayor's office, but the door wasn't empty. The head of security, a man named Vance with a face like a slab of granite, was waiting for him. "The mayor said you might be foolish enough to come here," Vance said, stepping away from the mahogany desk. The fight was short and brutal. Caleb was no brawler, but he was a man who had lost everything. When Vance lunged, Caleb didn't retreat. He grabbed a heavy brass award from the desk, a Citizen of the Year trophy, and swung it with every ounce of his desperation. The metal connected with Vance's temple, and the larger man staggered. Caleb drove his shoulder into the man's chest, sending them both crashing into a glass-topped display table. The glass shattered in a violent explosion of shards. Caleb scrambled up, his hands bleeding, and saw a memo pinned to the desk. "Guest House, Unit 4, Maya." He fled the building as the silent alarms began to pulse, reaching the town square just as the Founders' Day ceremony was reaching its peak. The crowd was a sea of smiling faces, all gathered to celebrate a history built on corpses. And there, on the stage, was the final blow. Silas was standing beside the mayor, dressed in a suit that didn't fit, shaking the man's hand. He looked into the microphone, his voice amplified across the square. "My brother, Caleb. He's been through a lot. He's confused. These stories about our father, they aren't true. I'm here to set the record straight." Caleb felt the world tilt. His own brother had been bought again, this time for the grandest stage of all. He was surrounded by deputies before he could even reach the stairs, their hands rough as they pinned him against the brick wall of the general store. "Be smart, Caleb," the mayor whispered, leaning over the edge of the stage as the crowd cheered for Silas. One word, and Maya disappears into the system. Forever. Caleb looked at the jeering crowd, at the polished monument to the town's founders, and then at the rusted maintenance grate at his feet. He remembered the old maps he'd used for his local history lectures, the tunnels built during the Prohibition era that ran beneath the square. With a sudden, violent jerk, he kicked the nearest deputy in the shin and dived. He disappeared into the dark, narrow hole before the guards could react, the smell of damp earth and rot swallowing him. He crawled through the pitch-black passages, guided only by the memory of the blueprints, until he reached the space directly beneath the podium. He burst through the floorboards like a ghost rising from the grave, his face bloody, his clothes torn, holding the heavy metal notary seal high above his head. "The truth doesn't belong to the Whitmans," he roared, his voice cutting through the startled silence of the square. "It belongs to the people they buried." He slammed the seal onto the podium, the heavy metal ringing like a bell. He pointed to the mayor, then to the documents he had managed to keep tucked in his jacket. "This seal matches the forgeries. It was in the mayor's office. My mother didn't sign these deeds. The Holloway family did it with her blood." The crowd wavered, the polished illusion of the day cracking under the sheer, raw force of Caleb's conviction. Silas stepped forward, looking at Caleb's battered face, and for the first time in 20 years, the shame in his pale blue eyes was replaced by something else. "He's right," Silas said, his voice cracking. He turned to the mayor, his hand trembling as he pointed at the man who had bought his soul. "He's right. They paid me to lie. They've been paying me since I was 18. The shift in the crowd was instantaneous, a low, rumbling murmur that grew into a roar of realization. The local police chief, a man who had spent his career looking the other way, saw the tide turning and stepped onto the stage, taking the seal from Caleb's hand with a grim nod. The resolution was a slow, painful unraveling. State authorities arrived within the hour, recovering Maya from the guest house and taking the mayor into custody for a dozen charges of fraud and kidnapping. But the final truth was found a week later, when Caleb led investigators to the ancestral land. Beneath the site of the new development, they found the mass grave, the remains of the laborers who had been erased to make room for the Whitman legacy. It wasn't just about money. It was about a century of murder that the town had agreed to forget. Now, Caleb sits on the porch of the old house, the land finally quiet. Silas is beside him, sober and silent, watching Maya play in the tall grass. Caleb is no longer a teacher. The town has shunned him for shattering their peace. But as he picks up a pen to write to his former students, he realizes he's finally free of the Whitman debt. He is the town's villain, perhaps, but he is his daughter's hero. And in the end, that is the only legacy that matters.